Hi, everybody. Welcome to another Chai Pakoda Reading Adda at the long weekend of LiteratureS 2021. With the theme of Belonging Beyond Borders, the long weekend is brought to you by 11 partnering European countries, the European Union, and Belong. I'm Urmi Bhattacheryya. I'm an independent journalist and author of the book After I Was Raped, that was published by Pan Macmillan in 2021. We have with us today Wojciech Jagielski from Poland, who is an award-winning journalist, a war correspondent, and a writer. His writings cover narratives from the Caucasus, Central Asia, and Africa. Four of his 9 books were published in English: Stars of Stone, which was based in Chechnya; Night Wanderers, which was based in Uganda; Burning the Grass, based in South Africa; and All Lara's Words, which was based in Syria and Caucasus. Wojciech, welcome to today's session at the festival. It's so wonderful to have you here and to be able to talk to you.
Hello, thank you for the invitation. It's really great to be in India, at least in such a virtual way. And I'm especially happy because India is a very close place for myself. I do not remember how many times I visited India, and it was the first country I visited outside Europe. I never cover India as a journalist, maybe because it is too close and it would be very difficult for me to write about India as an observer. But anyway, thank you very much for inviting me to your event.
Thank you so much, Wojciech. On that note, do you remember where you went to in India when you visited?
Oh, yes, it was 1986. We started in Delhi, of course, because we landed from Singapore. But then we made almost whole India trip around India. We started with Uttar Pradesh, then Bhubaneswar, then on the eastern India to Madurai, then Bangalore, Goa, Bombay or Mumbai today, and back to India, back to Delhi, and it was more than 20 trips. So there are a few states that I've never been.
That's wonderful. You actually have been all over.
I'm missing India, really. It's almost more than 2 years that I have not been in India, and I really miss it.
Yeah, it would have been wonderful if we could have done this in person somewhere outside. But hopefully, things clear up and it gets better, and we'll be able to do that sooner rather than later.
Sure.
So yeah, here's hoping.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Wojciech, we'll start today then with, the reading session, which is essentially, I know you picked for us this beautiful book. I managed to read the extract that you sent across, and I'd request you to read the Polish extract of that book.
Sure.
It's this book in English that's called Praying for Rain, and you write this about Afghanistan. So if you could just take us ahead with the Polish version, so we got a feel for the language, and then I'll go ahead with the English version.
Yes, sure. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, this is one of these books which were not published in English. Maybe because there were so many books published about Afghanistan after 2002. We have hundreds and hundreds of journalists, especially from United States. And my editors in the United States always ask me why we should publish Polish author book about Afghanistan if we have hundreds of very good American reporters. So anyway, it's great that we can talk at least about this book now.
Yeah.
I will start with Polish edition.
Yeah.
Okay. Spychając Masuda na brzegi granicznych rzek Amudarii i Panshiru, wyznaczających południowe rubieże byłego rosyjskiego imperium, talibowie przestraszyli nie na żarty Moskwę. W rządzonym przez nich Afganistanie Kreml widział siedlisko muzułmańskich buntowników zagrażających jego interesom w Azji Środkowej. Rosjanie postanowili wesprzeć Masuda. Chcieli, aby zatrzymał w górach Afganistanu falę muzułmańskiego fermentu i nie pozwolił, by zalała ona środkowoazjatyckie oazy na północnych brzegach Amudarii. Zadanie to spoczęło na dowództwie stacjonującej w Tadżykistanie 201 Dywizji, dziedziczce 40 Armii, która kilkanaście lat wcześniej bez powodzenia próbowała pokonać Masuda i podbić Afganistan. Dawni wrogowie zostali sojusznikami. Duszanbe, stolica Tadżykistanu, najwierniejszego sprzymierzeńca Rosji w Azji Środkowej, stała się faktycznie drugą tymczasową stolicą Masuda. Miasto zapełniło się afgańskimi politykami, komendantami, żołnierzami, kupcami i uchodźcami. Tadżycy zawsze chętnie pomagali swoim kuzynom z Afganistanu. Wdzięczni afgańscy Tadżycy pomogli zaś zakończyć krwawą wojnę domową w Tadżykistanie. Masud przekonał tadżyckich mudżahedinów, którym udzielił gościny w Panszirze, by podpisali pokój z rządzącymi w Duszanbe komunistami. W ten sposób zaskarbił sobie wdzięczność wszystkich Tadżyków, którzy widzieli w nim swego przywódcę. Choć nie lubił podróżować, w Duszanbe czuł się niemal jak w domu. Tu wywiózł swoją rodzinę, tu odwiedzał lekarzy. Rosyjskie śmigłowce z baz wojskowych w Duszanbe i Farharze dostarczały do afgańskiego Panshiru i Badachszanu towary i ludzi. Z lotnisk w Farharze piloci Masuda wyruszali na bombardowania obozów talibów. Bił się pan z Rosjanami, by zaprowadzić w Afganistanie muzułmańskie porządki. A dziś walczy pan z tymi, którzy w swoim mniemaniu takie właśnie porządki zaprowadzają. W dodatku w tej wojnie pomagała panu Rosja. Z wroga numer 1 stał się pan jej najważniejszym sojusznikiem w Azji Środkowej. Co się stało? Rosja się tak zmieniła, a może to pan się zmienił? Ja się zmieniłem, moje poglądy także. Zawsze walczyłem tylko o wolność dla mojego kraju. Zmieniły się czasy. To już nie jest Rosja komunistyczna, Rosja imperialna, choć stare przyzwyczajenia nieprędko idą w zapomnienie. 20 lat temu Moskwa chciała nas zniewolić. Dlatego walczyliśmy z nią na śmierć i życie. Dziś Rosja nie myśli o podbojach, chce tylko mieć na swoich południowych rubieżach stabilny, zjednoczony i przyjazny Afganistan. Ze strony Rosji nic nam nie zagraża. Niebezpieczeństwo grozi nam ze strony Pakistanu, który okazał się najnowszym najeźdźcą. Kiedy najechała nas Rosja, Pakistańczycy nam pomagali, byliśmy im wdzięczni. Chcieli jednak, żebyśmy byli ich wasalami, a nie przyjaciółmi. A my, Afgańczycy, nigdy nie będziemy niczyimi poddanymi. Dlatego dziś z nimi walczymy. Rzucę pan najcięższe oskarżenia pod adresem Pakistanu. Mam dowody. Mogę twierdzić, że walczymy nie z talibami, tylko odpieramy pakistańską napaść. Bez pomocy Pakistanu talibowie rozpadną się w ciągu miesiąca, a po 3 nie będzie po nich ani śladu. Mamy pakistańskich jeńców, znamy nazwy jednostek, które walczą w Afganistanie, nazwiska i stopnie dowódców, ich adresy domowe, a nawet nazwy szpitali, w których kurują się z ran. A jeśli za parę lat Rosja wystawi panu rachunek polityczny za dzisiejszą pomoc? Tej pomocy, jaką otrzymujemy dziś z Rosji, nie da się porównać ze wsparciem, jakie otrzymują od Pakistańczyków talibowie. Ale powtarzam, idzie mi tylko o wolność i będę walczył z każdym, kto spróbuje mi ją odebrać. Na przyjaźń zawsze odpowiadam przyjaźnią, na pomoc wdzięcznością, a na wrogość wrogością. Tak było, tak jest i tak będzie zawsze, niech Allah ma mnie w swojej opiece. W swojej dolinie Masud znał każdą pieczarę, każdy skalny uskok. Niechętnie walczył poza doliną i niechętnie się stamtąd ruszał. Nawet sprawując władzę w Kabulu, na noc zwykle wracał, choć droga zabierała mu 2 godziny. Nie jeździł do Peszawaru, ani nawet Heratu, Kandaharu czy Gardezu. Dopiero zapędzany przez talibów do doliny zgodził się niechętnie na wyprawy do irańskiego Meszhedu i tadżyckiego Duszanbe, ale tylko dlatego, że inaczej nie zapewniłby sobie dostaw broni. Podróże poza dolinę uważał za ekstrawagancję i stratę czasu. A może się po prostu po ludzku bał. Kiedy francuski rząd zaprosił go do Paryża i nawet wysłał specjalnie po niego samolot, Masud w ostatniej chwili nagle przepadł bez wieści. Jego towarzysze, przerażeni dojrzewającym skandalem, odnaleźli go w końcu, ale długo jeszcze tłumaczyli, że musi jechać do Europy, choćby po to, by przekonać europejskich polityków, iż nie jest ani barbarzyńcą, ani wasalem Rosji, mimo że bierze od niej broń i pieniądze. I udało mu się znakomicie. Sposobiąc się do letniej ofensywy przeciwko talibom, miał już wsparcie nie tylko Rosji, Iranu i Chin, ale także Europy. Do pełni szczęścia brakowało mu tylko akceptacji Amerykanów. Ci jednak, jak zawsze przekonani o jego rychłej klęsce, jak zawsze podejrzewali wszystkich afgańskich Tadżyków o przyrodzoną niemal skłonność do Rosji. Nawet nie chcieli słuchać, co ma im do powiedzenia. Mówili o nim umiarkowany radykał, czyli taki, z którym nie wiadomo co począć, z którego nie może być żadnego pożytku. Ani się go bać, ani się z nim przyjaźnić. Masud od lat przestrzegał świat przed ukrywającymi się w Afganistanie arabskimi banitami, z którymi musiał walczyć. Nie wierzono mu jednak. Żegnając się z Paryżem i wracając z pierwszej, jak się miało okazać, ostatniej podróży do Europy, Na pytanie amerykańskiego dziennikarza, czy chciałby powiedzieć coś prezydentowi z Waszyngtonu, Masud odparł: ci terroryści wkrótce zniszczą Amerykę i Europę. Powinniście mi uwierzyć i pomóc, zanim będzie za późno. Pół roku później arabscy straceńcy uprowadzili pasażerskie samoloty i przypuścili samobójczy atak na Waszyngton i Manhattan. 2 dni wcześniej zabili Masuda. I don't know, Urmi, shall I read another chapter?
Yes, Wojciech. So we also had this one. Of course, the first one that you read was the amateur Masood interview, right?
Mm-hmm.
Correct, correct. And I also had earmarked the Taliban and sport part, if you could read that too.
I cannot find this, but anyway, I will read the next chapter in Polish language, and then we will discuss about the English language that you will present. W okopach wyrytych na szczytach wzgórz pod wioską Ajhanum umorosani jesiennym błotem żołnierze jak zahipnotyzowani wpatrywali się w sylwetkę Masuda, przemierzającego szybkim krokiem strzeleckie stanowiska, punkty dowodzenia i schrony. W dole srebrzyły się ryżowe pola w rozlewisku Kokczy, która zaraz za wsią wpadała do Amudarii. Zmierzchało już i chłopi zapędzali do zagród osły, kozy i owce. Strudzone kobiety, stojąc po kolana w wodzie ryżowisk, prostowały krzyże i przysłaniając dłońmi oczy przed słońcem, zwoływały do domów rozbiegane dzieci. Mimo zmroku, u podnóża stromych wzgórz wciąż ciemniały tajemniczymi otworami wykute w piaskowcu groty. Pamiątka po wspaniałym niegdyś mieście założonym tu przez Aleksandra Macedońskiego. Macedończyk pojął za żonę miejscową dziewczynę, od której imienia nazwano potem wieś. Niegdyś miasto i tamtejsze pałace, teatr, świątynie i arsenał otaczały wysokie kamienne mury i wieże warowne, a prowadziły do niego 4 monumentalne bramy. Przybywający z całego świata archeolodzy wydobyli spod jego ruin tysiące bezcennych przedmiotów, dających świadectwo tego, jak żyli współcześni Aleksandrowie. Kiedy przed ćwierćwieczem w Afganistanie wybuchła wojna, archeologów zastąpili na wykopaliskach przygodni poszukiwacze skarbów, którzy zdobywali figurki i skorupy z Ajhanum na zamówienie cudzoziemskich marszandów albo sami sprzedawali je na bazarach w Peszawarze, Chwycie, Myszhedzie, Duszanbe. Dla żołnierzy z okopów na wzgórzach, którzy Macedończyka nazywali Iskanderem, groty Ajhanum i sama wioska miały wartość wyłącznie wojskową. Przystań nad rzeką służyła do transportowania paliwa, a groty nadawały się do obrony. Można w nich było otrzymać skrzynie z amunicją, ukryć czołgi i działa, a nawet schronić się przed artyleryjską kanonadą. Byli też zgodni co do tego, że groty lepiej wysadzić, niż pozwolić, by dostały się w ręce przeciwników. Istniało bowiem podejrzenie, że wędrując nimi można przedostać się podziemnymi tunelami aż na brzegi Amudarii i odciąć drogi ucieczki obrońcom miasta. Chłopak marzył tylko o tym, by zapaść się pod ziemię. Wyprężony na baczność, czerwony ze wstydu, nieprzytomnym wzrokiem wpatrywał się w Masuda, który repetował jego karabin. Przed chwilą na oczach towarzyszy i dowódców komendant zilustrował jego stanowisko strzeleckie w okopie i rozkazał, by zaprezentował, jak będzie odpierał wroga. Chłopak wskoczył do własnoręcznie wykopanego okopu i próbował złożyć się do strzału. Drżącymi ze zdenerwowania palcami mocował się z zamkiem. Masud wyjął mu karabin z rąk, po czym sam wszedł do okopu, by obnażyć jego wszystkie wady. Okop był niedorzecznie głęboki. Znakomicie chronił przed kulami nieprzyjaciela, ale strzelić z niego można było tylko na oślep. Czynim, że ty jesteś synem, chłopcze? Zapytał z politowaniem komendant, a chłopak wiedział już, że swoją bezmyślnością ściągnął hańbę nie tylko na siebie, ale także na ojca, który przed laty walczył w oddziale Masuda. Na szczęście komendant nie czekał odpowiedzi. Coraz bardziej rozzłoszczony brakiem wojskowego kunsztu beształ kolejnego żołnierza, który strzelając zamykał oczy. Boisz się własnego karabinu, a może jesteś takim strzelcem, że trafiasz do celu z zamkniętymi oczami? Komendant był bezlitosny. Wy, młodzi, tak niewiele jeszcze umiecie. Wszystkiego trzeba was uczyć, wszystko tłumaczyć. Kiedy myśmy zaczynali w Panszirze, nie mieliśmy czasu na naukę. To był przyspieszony i surowy kurs partyzantki. Do nas strzelano naprawdę. Ci, którzy popełniali błędy, źle kopali okopy, czy źle strzelali, nie dostawali nagan, tylko po prostu ginęli. Kiedy nieustannie grozi ci śmierć, błyskawicznie uczysz się, jak przetrwać. W świetle naftowych lamp, Zwyczajne, powszednie za dnia twarze wioskowych komendantów przemieniały się w tajemnicze, niemal mistyczne oblicza brodatych wojowników z baśni z 1001 nocy. W tonącej w mroku ziemiance, skupieni, wpatrzeni w gestykulującego Masuda, sprawiali wrażenie, jakby chcieli nauczyć się wszystkiego na pamięć. Co mówił, zapamiętać każde jego słowo. Komendant przemawiał krótkimi zdaniami, zwracając się do kolejnych dowódców. Mówiąc zaś, przebijał ich palącym spojrzeniem, jakby chciał przeniknąć ich najskrytsze myśli. Czy może na nich liczyć? Na kim może polegać? Kto zawiedzie? Kto zdradzi? Talibowie może i sprawują władzę nad ziemiami, ale nad ludźmi już nie, tłumaczy. Sprawy nie mają się wcale tak źle. Z wojskowego punktu widzenia zdobycie Kabulu nie przedstawia najmniejszej trudności, ale zdobyć władzę i utrzymać ją to już dwie różne sprawy. Nie wolno sięgać po władzę, jeśli nie jest się pewnym, że będzie się ją mogło skutecznie sprawować. Nie musimy się spieszyć. Czas działa na naszą korzyść. Jak dawniej rozmawiał codziennie z dziesiątkami komendantów i cywili, by utrzymać ich bojowego ducha, przekonać o konieczności dalszej walki i dalszych poświęceń. Codziennie emisariusze Masuda krążyli między Talokanem, Kulabem, Duszanbe, Mazar-e Sharif, Majmaną, Kunduzem. Wciąż musimy się upewniać, kto jest z nami, a kto już nie. To dziś największy problem, mówił Bismillah, jeden z najmłodszych i najzdolniejszych komendantów. Wielu upatrowało w nim następcę Masuda. Przyznawał, że wśród młodych mudżahedinów obserwuje się niepokojący upadek morale. Nie chcieli już walczyć dla samej sprawy, kazali sobie płacić za służbę. Wojna robi się coraz kosztowniejsza, ciężko wzdychał Bismillah, rozglądając się bacznie, czy aby Masud nie usłyszał jego słów. Na kolację był ryż, parujący, tłusty, biały z kawałkami baraniny. Migdały, południowe owoce i zielona herbata. Gdy służba uprzątnęła izbę, Masud rozłożył na dywanach wielkie płachty sztabowych map. Pochylony, niemal leżąc, odczytywał nazwy miejscowości wzdłuż rzek. Było już dobrze po północy. Zmęczoną twarz komendanta żłobiły głębsze bruzdy. Gdyby tak udało się wziąć pod kontrolę drogę wiodącą z Kunduzu do Talokanu, talibowie znaleźliby się w potrzasku. W Kunduzie jest wielkie lotnisko, najważniejsza baza zaopatrzeniowa dla jego wojsk na północy kraju. Gdyby się nim to zabrali, nie mogliby sprowadzać z południa ani posiłków, ani broni, ani amunicji. Szyici Karima Halilego odbili część prowincji Bamian. Hadzi Abdul Kadir siedzi w Nuristanie i odbudowuje swoją armię w Nagmanie i Nangarharze. Nasi ludzie panują nad większością Samarganu. Gdyby jeszcze wrócił z Meszhedu Ismail Han i zaczął powstanie w Heracie, talibowie musieliby walczyć na wiele frontów. Nie mają na to siły, a ja, odkąd poddałem Kabul, nie korzystałem jeszcze w walkach ze swoich najlepszych ludzi z Panshiru. Wystarczyło mi pospolite ruszenie. Nie brałem też rekruta z Badachszanu, a w każdej chwili mogę postawić pod broń nawet 10 000 tamtejszych ludzi. Już w przyszłym roku mogę mieć wielką armię. Uważa pan, że pokonując talibów i wracając do władzy w Kabulu cokolwiek pan załatwi? Nie, wojna, nawet zwycięska, niczego nie rozwiąże. Celem mojej walki jest zmuszenie talibów, by zgodzili się na wolne i uczciwe wybory pod międzynarodowym nadzorem. Twierdzą, że cały kraj ich popiera. Tak było, gdy maszerowali od miasta do miasta, zapowiadając, że chcą położyć kres wojnie i zaprowadzić porządek. Ale wystarczyło kilka miesięcy ich rządów, by ludzie pojęli, kim są naprawdę. Komunistów, a nawet rosyjskich żołnierzy też witano w Afganistanie jako zbawców. Nie chcemy zawierać z talibami pokoju tylko po to, by podzielić się władzą. Jeśli są tak pewni swojej popularności, to proszę bardzo, daję im szansę, by wzięli całą władzę i w dodatku w sposób najbardziej prawowity. Wybory. Jeśli wygrają, wyjadę z kraju, bo nie uśmiecha mi się żyć w państwie. Ale nikt na świecie nie ośmieli się podważyć ich wiarygodności. Dlaczego więc nie chcą tego spróbować? Bo wiedzą, że w wyborach nie mają szans. Ludzie nie chcą żyć według ich praw. Co wspólnego z islamem ma długość brody? To fanatycy, niewiele różniący się od komunistów. Nie umieją rządzić, mogą tylko dalej podbijać i podbijać. Dlatego nigdy im się nie poddam, dlatego będę z nimi walczył. Czy po 25 latach spędzonych na wojnach może pan sobie wyobrazić siebie w jakiejś innej roli? Czy potrafi pan jeszcze robić coś innego? Nie ja tę wojnę zacząłem, ale co miałem zrobić? Poddać się Rosjanom, Hekmatiarowi, Dostumowi, talibom? Czy tak byłoby lepiej? Czy miałem inny wybór niż walczyć? Jeśli będzie trzeba, gotów jestem walczyć do końca swych dni. W czas pokoju chciałbym przydać się przy odbudowie kraju. Jestem w końcu niedoszłym architektem, a zamiast budować domy wciąż wysadzam mosty. Nie uważam jednak, żebym zmarnował życie. A czy nie uważa pan, że ideał, któremu poświęcił pan życie, sprawiedliwy i wolny Afganistan, z każdym rokiem staje się coraz odleglejszy? Czy mimo wszystko nie czuje się pan przegrany? Przegrany? Przecież wciąż walczę. Od czasu pierwszej nocnej wizyty w Jabal Sarraj spotykałem Masuda regularnie, mniej więcej co 2 lata. Jesienią 96, gdy umykając przed żołnierzami emira Omara poddał Kabul, odnalazłem go w dolinie Panshiru, gdzie szykował się do kontrnatarcia. Ani ten, ani żaden następny atak się nie powiódł. Kiedy widziałem się z nim wiosną 98, nadal tkwił w dolinie oblężonej przez talibów, którzy rozpuszczali plotki, iż Masud sposobie się do ucieczki z kraju, że jego koniec jest bliski. W grudniu 99 w zagubionej na pustyni zasypywanej piaskowymi burzami wiosce Hodża Bahauddin, Masud wciąż pełen nadziei szykował się do nowej wojny. Pozwolił sobie towarzyszyć podczas inspekcji wojsk, a potem przez północy, wreszcie zrelaksowany i mniej oficjalny, opowiadał o swoim życiu i pochylony nad mapami objaśniał plany przyszłych operacji. Myśliłem sobie, że uczynię go bohaterem książki o buntownikach, którą zamierzałem napisać. Nieco zakłopotany zgodził się na następne wizyty. Wyjeżdżałem zadowolony, przekonany, że zrobiłem dobry początek. Widzieliśmy się wtedy po raz ostatni. Zbyt długo odkładałem następną podróż do Afganistanu, gdzie czas wydawał się stać w miejscu, gdzie nic się nie zmieniało, a więc można było zawsze ze wszystkim zdążyć. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Wojciech. So I will now move on to the English translation. Sure,
Okay.
and I'm going to read this part that was translated by Antonia Lloyd Jones. Right. So I'll begin with the translator's note. In September 1996, the Taliban took Kabul and assumed power in Afghanistan. The leader of their main opposition, Ahmad Shah Massoud, was forced to escape the city, but supported by many of the loyal Mujahideen who had backed him in the war with Russia and the civil war that followed, he continued to pose a major threat to the Taliban. Jagielski interviewed Massoud on several occasions throughout his career. So here we go. By forcing Massoud back to the banks of the frontier rivers Darya and Panju, which marked the southern boundaries of the former Russian Empire, the Taliban gave Moscow a serious shock. The Kremlin saw Afghanistan under the Taliban as a hotbed of Islamic rebels that posed a threat to its interests in Central Asia. The Russians decided to support Massoud. They wanted him to hold back the wave of Islamic ferment in the mountains of Afghanistan and not let it inundate the Central Asian oases on the northern shores of the Darya. This task rested with the command of the 201st Division stationed in Tajikistan, the successor to the 40th Army that a dozen years earlier had unsuccessfully tried to defeat Massoud and conquer Afghanistan. The former enemies had become allies. Dushanbe, the capital of Tajikistan, Russia's most loyal ally in Central Asia, became, to all intents and purposes, Massoud's second temporary capital. The city was filled with Afghan politicians, commanders, soldiers, dealers, and refugees. The Tajiks were always willing to help their cousins from Afghanistan.
Hello, I think we lost Urmi. If you could just give us a second, we'll try to patch Urmi back in. Hi, Urmi, we can hear you. Sorry, we lost
you. Hi, thank you so much. Yes, we had this absurd power outage, which is why I lost you. Am I audible to everybody?
Yes, you can continue reading.
All right. Okay. Thank you so much. All right. So we come here. So this is essentially Wojciech's interview with Massoud, and these are Massoud's questions answered. You fought against the Russians in order to introduce an Islamic rule of law into Afghanistan, but now you're fighting against those who, in their opinion, are introducing that very kind of order. What's more, Russia is helping you wage this war. From enemy number one, you've become her most important ally in Central Asia. What has happened? Has Russia really changed that much? Or maybe it's you that has changed. I have changed. So have my views. I've never fought for anything but my country's freedom. Times have changed. It's no longer communist Russia, imperialist Russia, or the old habits do die hard. 20 years ago, Moscow wanted to subjugate us. That was why we fought a life and death war against her. Nowadays, Russia isn't thinking about conquest. She just wants a stable, united and friendly Afghanistan on her southern borders. Russia presents no threat to us. There is a danger to us from Pakistan, which has proved the latest invader. When Russia invaded us, the Pakistanis helped us, and we were grateful to them. However, they wanted us to be their vassals, not their friends. But we, the Afghans, will never be anyone's subject. That's why we're fighting against them now. You're making very serious accusations against Pakistan. I have proof. I can confirm that we are not fighting against the Taliban, but repulsing a Pakistani invasion. Without Pakistan's help, the Taliban would collapse in the course of a month, and in three, there wouldn't be a trace of them left. We have Pakistani prisoners of war. We know the names of the units that are fighting in Afghanistan, the names and ranks of the commanders, their home addresses, and even the names of the hospitals where they have their wounds treated. Well, what if in a couple of years' time Russia presents you with the political bill for today's help? The help you're getting from Russia today bears no comparison with the support the Taliban are receiving from Pakistan. But I repeat, my only concern is freedom, and I'll fight against anyone who tries to take it away from me. I always respond to friendship with friendship, to help with gratitude, and to enmity with enmity. So it has been, so it is, and so it will be forever. May Allah protect me. In his valley, Masood knew every cave and every rocky outcrop. He was reluctant to fight outside the valley or to move from it. Even while holding power in Kabul, he usually came back for the night, although the journey took him 2 hours. He never went to Peshawar or even Herat, Kandahar, or Gadez. Only when forced into the valley by the Taliban did he reluctantly agree to travel to Meshed in Iran and to Dushanbe in Tajikistan, but only because otherwise he wouldn't be able to secure a supply of weapons. He regarded journeys outside the valley as an extravagance and a waste of time. Or maybe he was quite simply and humanly afraid. When the French government invited him to Paris and even sent a special airplane from him, at the last moment, Masood suddenly went missing. Worried about the impending scandal, his comrades found him in the end, but still took a long time to persuade him that he had to go to Europe, if only to convince the European politicians that he was neither a barbarian nor a vassal of Russia, despite the fact that he was accepting arms and money from her. And he succeeded. As he prepared for a summer offensive against the Taliban, by now he had the support not only of Russia, Iran, India, and China, but also of Europe. For complete success, all he needed was to be accepted by the Americans. They, however, convinced as ever of his imminent defeat, as ever suspected all Afghan Tajiks of an all but innate pro-Russia tendency and refused to even listen to what he had to say to them. They referred to him as a moderate radical, in other words, the sort of person they didn't know what to do with and who could be of no use to them. They had neither to fear him nor to make friends with him. For years, Masood warned the world about the Arab exiles hiding in Afghanistan, whom it would have to fight, but no one believed him. As he was bidding farewell to Paris on his way back from the first, and as it would turn out, the last of his trips to Europe, when asked by an American journalist whether there was anything he'd like to say to the president in Washington, Masood replied, "Those terrorists will soon destroy America and Europe. You should believe me and help me before it's too late." 6 months later, a group of Arab desperados hijacked some passenger planes and made suicide attacks on Washington and Manhattan. 2 days earlier, they had killed Masood.
Okay, I muted the mic.
Not a
Yes.
problem. Not a problem. That was an incredibly powerful section, and I absolutely love reading that. I think I've read it quite a few times actually, and I enjoy that. I'm honestly quite befuddled why America would not want to publish that book, despite the fact that they've got their own journalists reporting on Afghanistan. But this is of course unique because, from what I understand, this book is a collection of your interviews that you conducted in Afghanistan for almost 2 decades. Am I right?
Yes, it's not only the interviews. I traveled to Afghanistan since 1992. My first trip was April 1992 when Mujahideens taken Kabul. And it was Masood who was in charge of Kabul. He was one of the
Right.
commanders fighting for the capital, and he was the first who entered capital. He was the Minister of Defense in the first Mujahideen government. Then I traveled almost every year back to Afghanistan. My last trip was 2010. So Praying for the Rain, it's a story of my almost 20 trips to Afghanistan and almost 2 years that putting all together these trips I spent in Afghanistan. It was unique experience for me. I wouldn't say unique time because the time maybe was good for me as a journalist, as a reporter, but for the Afghans, it was the worst possible time ever because they had the cruelest civil war, which is the worst thing that could happen to any country and to any people.
That's correct, Wojciech. And, it's because you've been there so many times. You obviously had a ringside view, and now also you've got quite a strong perspective of what's been happening in Afghanistan. And, since you speak about 1992, and that's a really pivotal time because ever since then, and before that, with the Soviet occupation and then the withdrawal, and then with the US coming in and then the withdrawal, do you see this year in 2021, do you kind of see history repeating itself in a way that, it's kind of this relentless cycle of confusion and mess that this country has been plagued with? Is it something you've seen before?
Yes, I mean, it's not history that is repeating itself. It's us who doesn't want to learn anything from the history. Maybe it's us, the people from the West, from the Europe, or maybe it's Afghans, or maybe it's us, Europeans and Afghans all together, but it seems we learn nothing from the history. The problem of Afghanistan always, or at least from the times when the British came to Asia, was that it was treated not as a country to conquer, but as a buffer zone between the sphere of influence of the foreign superpowers, Britain and Russia, then America and Russia. Also between, well, it's also the problem of the interference or international politics between India and Pakistan, Iran, Saudi Arabia. So Afghanistan was always under influence of foreign nations, and nobody treated Afghanistan seriously, only as a buffer zone. If oil was discovered in Afghanistan in some miracle way, or any other minerals, maybe it would be different, but everyone treated Afghanistan only as a buffer zone, didn't care about the people. They needed only a border. So Afghanistan without the people would be good for them as well, like Afghanistan with the people. And this foreign interference was the major problems for Afghanistan and Afghan in the recent history, because they were trying to survive or to find out a way how to defend themselves. And basically speaking, it was two solutions for them. One was isolation, total isolation. You know that there is no railway in Afghanistan even today, because they didn't want British to build a railway to Kabul, because in that way they suspect that, okay, if they build a railway to Kabul, immediately they will start to interfere in our Afghan matters. So isolation was one option. The other, the same radical option, was modernization. But if you want to modernize very quickly the country and society who is very conservative and isolated, it is that sentence for the modernizers. So all kings, all prime ministers, all presidents who wanted to do the change too quickly, sooner or later, and rather sooner than later, were overthrown. And again and again and again, you had the big wars and small wars in Afghanistan. Big war in the 80s, which was a civil war also, but first of all, the proxy war between East and West. And after this war, won by the Americans or lost by the Russians withdrawn. But Americans, they said, okay, it's done. we don't care about Afghanistan. Russia was conquered, was beaten in Afghanistan, and it's enough for us. So we leave Afghanistan. And after this, it was a civil war and another countries who were trying to interfere for their own interest. So, and this is the cycles that are repeating themselves and again and again and again. And I think that today, big war is over. America lost, they withdrawn, and all the West withdrawn from Afghanistan. Is it good for Afghanistan or not? It's good because the big war is over. So there is no war so far in Afghanistan, but I'm not pretty sure if there is no risk for another civil war. We have this war in Afghanistan for almost 50 years. How many generations? The Afghans stopped talking with themselves. They fight between themselves. They do not talk, they do not discuss, but they get the habit to fight. If I do not agree with you, we will try to solve our problem, right? But if we are brought up in the neighborhood that you do not discuss, you fight. So they will fight, and I'm not sure. I'm not very optimistic, and I cannot. I wouldn't tell that there is a guarantee that we will not have another civil war in Afghanistan, and that would be. I wouldn't like to live as Afghan in the country ruled by Taliban, but it is, how to say, they said it's bad things and worse thing. So Taliban government would be a bad thing for me, but the worst solution would be another civil war. I do not hear you.
Yeah. Wojciech, because you talk about civil war, and of course, the part that we read right now, is this interview that you conducted with Ahmad Shah Massoud. And, that last sentence that I ended on in that section is particularly chilling, where he tells journalists that, there will be an attack if you do not control the Arab desperados. And 2 days before the September 11 attack is when he's killed, he's assassinated. And of course, you interviewed him several times before that during those years. So I'd love to ask you two questions. One, what do you think Massoud, who was pretty much the first anti-Taliban force that we saw there, what would he have had to say about the situation today? How do you think he would have dealt with it? And what were your own impressions about him at the time?
I will start with second question. Well, he was a very charismatic person, no doubt about this. I met dozens of politicians, leaders, revolutionaries in my journalist career, and I would say that two of them were very charismatic. One was Nelson Mandela, and another one was Massoud. I do not compare them. I do not put them on the same level, but he was very open-minded, also in comparison with the others. He was trying to find out solution for Afghanistan. I think that he was young. 40 years is nothing for the Afghan leaders. And he was pretty sure that he cannot be a leader of the whole nation. He would never be accepted as a young person and as a Tajik, of course. You have only Pashtuns as leaders in Afghanistan. Two exemptions is Burhanuddin Rabbani, who was the president and the political chief of Ahmad Shah Massoud, and another short-lived emir in the beginning of 20th century, overthrown very quickly. So he knew his limits, but he had an idea how the Afghanistan should look like. The problem for him was that he was a military commander, and the time was it was not good time for peaceful solution. They stopped the big war, and they immediately started among themselves to fight for the power, for the influence, for the, I don't know, for anything that was the result of the war. So it was another war, and there is no good time for reflection, for discussion. Even in Afghanistan, when time is really different than in Europe. But still, there was no good many possibilities for this discussion, peaceful discussion, and for searching solution. What he would do today, I I asked this question myself, what he would do if he survived this terrorist attack and if he was alive when Americans was in charge in Afghanistan. And I cannot imagine myself, Masood, uh, cooperating with Americans the same way like the other Afghan politicians were cooperating. I cannot imagine myself, Masood, in the role of Ashraf Ghani or Hamid Karzai. Maybe he will fight against Americans because he hated foreign interference, any foreign interference. So maybe he would start rebellion in Panjshir against Americans. And I think that it would be very difficult for the Americans to accommodate Masood when they were in charge of Afghanistan. Can you imagine President Karzai, who would be the president of Afghanistan, having such an influential personality like Ahmad Masood as his Minister of Defense, who can do nothing because the Americans are fighting their war in Afghanistan? I cannot imagine myself, Masood, doing these things. It's such I'm a very big fan of rock music, old rock music. And it was a rock group called The Who in the 60s and in the 70s. And they were singing such a famous hit, My Generation. And the words were this, I hope I die before get old. So I think it was the blessing of Almighty that Masood died young, because getting old in Afghanistan ruled by Americans, he would become very frustrated and unhappy. So this is like how I see. But you have another, how to say, Masood's son is in Panjshir or was in Panjshir, and he didn't agree. He quarreled with Taliban. He started the fight with Taliban. He lost the first battle, but the war is not over. So I think that he is leading the way of his father. He's following the steps of his father. I don't know where is he now. Another personal connection between me and Masood's stories is Fahim Dashti. He was a good friend of mine, and he was a journalist who was badly wounded in the terrorist attack that Masood was killed. But he survived, and we met several times since 2001 till 2010 in Kabul. He was the journalist editor-in-chief of very important weekly in Kabul. I lost the touch with him, but I find out that he was in Panjshir when Taliban took Kabul. And then I called him and we talked again. And I was trying to, even had such idea, maybe I will go for another trip to Afghanistan just to talk with Ahmad Masood. I met him as a 12 years old boy in Dushanbe. And Fahim Dashti promised me that he will help me with this interview and with this meeting. But when the war started in Panjshir, Fahim Dashti was killed. So it's a very tragic story, Panjshiri story, Afghan story. Sometimes you have the stories with no happy ending. And the Afghan story has no happy ending so far. This is my opinion.
Yeah. I understand, Wojciech, and it's absolutely wonderful and powerful to hear it from you, who's been there, seen things on the front lines. And it was lovely to hear about you having seen him as a 12-year-old boy. So, of course, there's that personal connect that you have to Afghan history and the way it's evolved through the 90s to right now. Sort of talking about that, do you feel when you do report on war and when you write about it, and you're reporting on a non-Western world, so to speak, for a larger audience, often there's this bias that the Western world has about a non-Western world, stereotypes, etc. Do you ever feel protective about the place if you've been traveling to it very many times, or about its people and the stories that you hear? Is there a sense of wanting to protect them from not being seen a particular way? How do you, like, what's the mindset like there?
Well, I cannot pretend that I'm not European. I am European. My eyes are European. My mentality is European, is Polish, which is very different from British. My Polish experience and Polish history is different from British history. My readers are Poles. They are the first readers. If the books I write in Polish. So this is my perspective, my very personal perspective, because my other friends, Polish reporters, if we go together, 2 or 3 persons to the same Afghanistan, same moment, we would bring back 3, 4 different stories because we are different. So this is very personal. This is very personal story. This is the story about Afghanistan, about my Afghanistan, my experiences, my feelings connected with the trips. Afghanistan in April 1992 was different Afghanistan for me than Afghanistan in November 1993, and very different from Afghanistan in, let's say, October 2001. And the story was different. What I do, I'm a reporter, but I spent all my life as a journalist life in the foreign desks, specializing in particular areas. Afghanistan was one of these areas. That's why I went so many times to Afghanistan. So maybe I knew more about Afghanistan than my colleagues, than my readers, definitely. I don't know if it is true. Because, well, the truth, we can discuss what is true. It's also very, 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 very subjective thing.
Yeah.
So I'm not protecting Afghanistan before being described Western way or European way. What I'm trying to do is to write about Afghanistan from the perspective of a foreigner in Afghanistan. During my travels, I had such a very important for me, I don't know what to say, happening. Once traveling through Uzbekistan, the train stopped in the place called Karshi. It's a small place. In the former Soviet Union, in every city, you have the post office with the big map hanging on the wall. The maps were the same. The only difference was that always the center of the map was the place that you were in. So if you traveled to, let's say, Vladivostok was the center of the world. And it was the first place that I saw such a map. And Karshi was the middle of the world. And believe me, the world seen from Karshi as a center will look very different than the same world looked when Warsaw was in the center. So it was for me, it was very important. I decided that, okay, I'm a Polish journalist and I'm writing for Polish readers, but I should try to describe Uzbekistan, to describe Karshi from Karshi. You know what I mean? So being in Afghanistan, I try to understand, to feel the Afghan way of living, doing. My biggest regret was that I never learned Dari or Pashto, so I could talk with them in their language, but I never thought I would travel to Afghanistan so many times.
Did you ever wish you had?
Pardon?
Did you ever wish you had learned Dari or Pashto?
No, I mean, after so many trips, I think I understood Dari, but I would never try even to speak Dari. Now my son speaks Persian language fluently, and I so envy him. And it is also very moving when you sit in one room, you read your book, and you hear from the other room, the sounds that seems very familiar to you. It's like a music. So having Afghanistan around the corner.
That's lovely. Wojciech, I will ask you one other question, and then we'll go to author questions, audience questions. There's these couple of lines that I read that you'd written, which really stayed with me. It's this thing that I think were translated from Polish, again by Antonia Lloyd-Jones, where you write about Afghanistan, saying Afghanistan meant eternal waiting, always, everywhere, and for everything. Hours spent over bowls of colorless tea, on conversations about nothing, but most often in silence, on self-contemplation and pulling an ugly face, which was meant to express curiosity and a friendly smile. I got the impression that the Afghans are never in a hurry for anything, that they always have time for everything. Then I realized that in a country where there's nothing going on, the citizens have nothing to do. If you could tell me, what was going on in your mind when you wrote about this waiting for Afghanistan?
I think that this was maybe the most precious experience for me. When I came to Afghanistan for the first time, well, my trips in Afghanistan in 90s were the trips with hardly communication, because the people who knew the foreign languages, Russian, English, they left. The people who studied in Russia, in Moscow, in Petersburg, they left to Soviet Union, to Europe. The people who knew anything during the Soviet war, they left to Pakistan. So the people who left, they hardly speak any foreign language. But because I didn't speak Dari and I didn't speak Pashto, I have to work with them. And sometimes I was left without any translator. I was coming to see some minister or some commander. He didn't speak Russian. He didn't speak English. I haven't knew a single word in Dari or in Pashto. But still, we were sitting, waiting for any translator who could be around. And that time that I sat in some minister's office or sitting in the room with the commander, looking at each other and in complete silence, only smiling. Sometimes I got an impression that maybe this silence gave me more knowledge about Afghanistan than all these interviews. Sometimes silence is more important than words. If you do the interviews with the politicians, usually for the journalists, it's a scoop, something very important, right? Because we talk with the president of India, we talk with the prime minister of Pakistan, famous name, very big position. But if you look, so it's a scoop for journalists. Our journalist made an interview with president of South Africa. But if you come back to this interview in 1 week or 2 months, you will realize that there is nothing. It's only words, nothing. Yeah. They are saying something, to show off. But if you spend half an hour or 1 hour or 2 hours time with someone without speaking, you knew that person may be better than if you communicate with words. So Afghanistan was a very personal experience and very precious one for me. It learned me a lot. It touched me a lot. To be patient, to realize that the world that I live in is not given forever. That I can lose it. There's nothing for free. That you have to take good care about everything. That if you go to see people who are living such a tragic life, you have to be, the empathy. Well, I think that Afghanistan gave me much more that I give back to Afghanistan, and I will be always I will always that there will never be a balance.
Yeah. Would you go back anytime in the near future?
Not as a journalist. I'm
Yeah.
61, so I'm the retired war correspondent. But I'd love to come back to Afghanistan, of course. Although, being frankly, I would prefer to come back to this Afghanistan in the 90s. It was not a maybe better place,
Yes.
but it was very unique place. And I had such sometimes, from time to time, I had such a feeling that Afghanistan was created for me, because there were no other journalists. And
Yeah.
so I have very personal feelings to India because of my personal experience, but Afghanistan is also very close to me. And I'd love to come back to Afghanistan, sure.
Right. Wojciech, one of our readers says it's more of a comment than a question. He says it's like a crop. America grew the crop and now they're seeing the result of their crop. How would you comment on that when it comes to Afghanistan right now?
I agree, completely agree. Afghanistan, Americans came to Afghanistan. Well, the only, how to say, they didn't want to come to Afghanistan with the war. They were preparing themselves for a war in Iraq. But New York and Washington they were attacked by Al Qaeda, and the headquarters of Al Qaeda at that time was in Kandahar. So they didn't want, but they didn't have any other choice. They had to attack Afghanistan, but then they didn't have the plan B. They had to, but I don't know. They prayed that everything will be solved just like that.
Yeah.
The war was won very easily without the fight. But I was in Kabul 3 times when the government changed without the fight. 1992, Najibullah collapsed, Massoud came.
Yeah.
1996, Massoud withdrawn, Taliban came, no fight.
Yeah.
2001, Taliban withdraw, American came. So there was no fight. And they thought maybe that it is so easy to win the war in Afghanistan. And it is true. But to control Afghanistan was completely different thing. They spent 20 years in Afghanistan and billions of dollars and lost chances, lost opportunities. For me, the worst thing that happened in Afghanistan and for the Afghans was that the West, we compromised all good things that we're trying to offer to Afghanistan. I cannot imagine myself Afghans who would trust Westerners again. So yes, this is the crop that we deserved. And we cannot, of course, we tried to do, and the Americans are trying to do, to accuse the Afghan themselves that if they don't fight, why should we fight for them? But who fought the war? It's the Americans who fought the war, and the Afghans were supposed to pretend that they are doing the Afghan war. So I'm completely agree, and it's made me very sad and frustrated.
Wojciech, I had one other question I remember from the reading section that I read, and it's something that, has been talked about, where Massoud says that, Taliban's, more than the occupation here, Russia's occupation is the fact that Taliban's been getting a lot of help from Pakistan. And he says that, I think, sometime in the 90s, and you call him out on it. You say that, that's a very serious allegation, and you have anything to back that. And then, he speaks about it, and he's very vociferous about the fact that it's getting a lot of outside help. Was that ever something that, in your later trips or in your further interviews and in your reporting, something that you saw happening, like also,
it was obvious that the Afghan leaders were getting support from the other countries, and that Pakistan was very deeply involved in Afghan matters. It's obvious. But for such accusation, politicians can make such accusation, can make such a statement. For the journalist, you need to find independent proofs. I never had such independent proofs. I saw people who were shown me as a Pakistani captured soldiers, but I didn't have any proofs. I didn't have a chance to talk with them personally. So this is like this. No independent proofs for me, at least.
Understood. All right, Wojciech, I think we're out of time, but it's been so incredible. It was incredible just hearing you answer those questions, and I just had like just a host of several that I wanted to hear you talk about Afghanistan. And here's hoping that you are able to go back not as a journalist, but as a person who connected to the country and who still, has a lot of dreams and aspirations for the place. But thank you so much for being here today and for sharing some of those memories and anecdotes and experiences with us. So
Thank you very much. Thank you, Urmi.
Thank you so much.
Looking forward seeing you in Delhi. Looking forward be back in India. And thanks for the invitation again. It was all my pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Urmi, and thank you, Wojciech. Thanks for joining us so much. Thanks a lot. For those of you who are going to be staying here, Urmi is going to join back with us at the 7 p.m. session with Nilanjana Roy and Kubra Gumuse, which is a session on internet and women and innovation.